I remember the smell before I remember the sight. Diesel and dust, the metallic taste of sweat in the air as our train slowed somewhere deep in Texas. It was June 4th, 1943. We were soldiers of the Africa Corps, veterans of 1,000 dunes, stripped of our uniforms, of our pride, of the myth that we had belonged to a superior race, and yet nothing had prepared us for what we saw through that glass. The night outside wasn't dark, it was alive. Back home in Germany, the world ended with sunset. Cities vanished under blackout drapes, farmhouses went dark like snuffed candles. But here, beyond the rail line, every horizon was lit, an ocean of lamps glowing from barns, stores, filling stations, even the porches of farmhouses. It looked like the sky had fallen and scattered its stars on the ground. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass of the Pullman window, thinking my eyes deceived me. No one had told us America could shine like this. We'd been taught that the United States was weak, decadent, collapsing under the weight of its own greed. Yet the train rolled past fields threaded with electric lines, past small towns with lighted billboards, past roads crawling with trucks even at midnight. Someone beside me whispered, "It's a trick. They're showing us one rich area to fool us." But the lights went on for hours. The Americans must be lying to us, I had written earlier that day in my hidden diary. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts. Those words now felt childish. I tore out the page. When the train stopped, I saw something stranger still. We stepped, not from cattle cars but from cushioned coaches lined with sleeping berths, each compartment still smelling of coffee and soap. "The guards were polite. This way, gentlemen," one said, gesturing toward the platform. "No rifles in our backs, no shouting." Outside, hundreds of townspeople stood waiting, silent, curious. Children waved. Some even smiled. I had imagined our arrival in chains. Instead, they watched us like travelers from a foreign planet. One American sergeant pointed toward the sky. "Welcome to Texas," he said. "Bigger than all of Germany." His grin was easy, confident, as if he spoke for a country that feared nothing. Behind him, the floodlights burned white as noon. We marched down Railroad Street in Mexia, a small town by American measure, yet its depot blazed with more electricity than all of Hamburg's blocks combined. Even the smallest grocery shop had neon signs flickering in colors I hadn't seen in years. I caught myself staring at a Coca-Cola logo, mesmerized by its red glow. It looked like sin, like luxury, like proof that everything we had believed was built on sand. I tried to remember when I had last seen a street so bright. 1940 perhaps, before the blackout orders. Before the war devoured the night, one of our officers, a man who'd served under Rommel himself, murmured, "We've lost more than Africa." He was right. Something in us began to crumble that evening, not just faith in our generals, but the entire scaffolding of arrogance that had carried us through defeat. Later, when we were herded into trucks, I could still see the lights in the distance. The Texas sky was black velvet, the stars above indistinguishable from the electric constellations below. I thought of my wife, still living under blackout curtains, and wondered what she would say if she saw this country where even barns glittered. They brought us to the camp gates past midnight. The wooden sign read, "Camp Hearn." I had expected barbed wire and shouting guards, perhaps the smell of death. Instead, I smelled freshly cut timber, wet earth, and coffee. Rows of barracks stretched before us, their windows glowing warmly. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it looked like a holiday village. The guards handed us blankets and told us we would have breakfast in the morning: eggs, bread, coffee. Coffee. I hadn't tasted real coffee in a year. When I finally lay down, the bunk sheets smelled of starch and sun. Somewhere outside a generator hummed steadily. I stared at the ceiling and felt the hum travel through the wood, through my bones. In that vibration I heard something larger than machinery, a rhythm, constant, confident, endless. This country pulsed with energy like a living creature. Before sleep took me, I opened my diary again. I wrote one sentence, careful not to let my hands shake. If this is the enemy, then everything we were told is a lie. By dawn, when the bugles sounded and the camp lights flicked on again, I knew that the war, for me, had already changed. The Americans had not beaten us with weapons. Not yet. They had done it with light. The journey to this strange land had begun weeks earlier, not with maps or orders, but with silence, an unbearable, echoing silence across the Tunisian hills. It was May 1943, the end of everything we had once called the Africa Corps. Our radios had gone dead, our fuel ran out, and the sand itself seemed to turn against us. When the British closed in from the east and the Americans from the west, our officers said we would fight to the last cartridge. But by noon on May 13th, we were no longer soldiers, just survivors of a dead empire waiting to be counted. We burned our last papers that day, though not our pride. The smell of the scorched maps still clung to my uniform as we were marched toward Oran, Algeria, where the Americans had built a temporary holding camp. I had expected chaos, perhaps cruelty. Instead, what I found unnerved me more deeply than any battlefield: order. The Americans processed tens of thousands of us every day, with a precision that didn't shout. It hummed, steady and mechanical, like one of their engines. Lines of captured men shuffled toward tents where cameras clicked, where clerks stamped papers, where doctors examined us with instruments cleaner and newer than anything I had seen in German field hospitals. They even had translators, young Americans speaking perfect German, explaining Geneva Convention rights as if reading from a catechism. One of them, a lieutenant with dark hair and glasses, looked hardly older than I. He said, "You will be treated as soldiers, not criminals. Cooperate, and you will be safe." His voice was calm, almost kind. I wanted to hate him, but couldn't. When he offered me a cigarette, I hesitated. Then, I took it. It was Turkish tobacco, smooth, expensive. I remember thinking, how does a country at war have the luxury to waste this on prisoners? That night they fed us white bread, fresh meat, and real coffee. We thought it was a performance meant to deceive us, some psychological trick. But the next day, the same rations arrived again. And the next. One of my comrades whispered, "If this is propaganda, it's the most convincing kind. Our stomachs believe it." I began to notice smaller things. The boots of the American guards were uniform, all new, all polished. Their belts gleamed. Their canteens were aluminum, light, and plentiful. Our own army had been recycling equipment since 1942, melting down helmets to make spare parts. These men threw things away that we would have repaired a dozen times, and still they smiled. In my diary I wrote, "Their confidence is quiet, ours used to be loud." We learned of the Liberty ships while we waited for transport cargo vessels built faster than anything in history, some in less than 5 days. It sounded impossible, the way a child might brag. But when we were marched down to the docks, there they were, gray giants rocking gently in the harbor, smoke curling from their stacks, names painted fresh on their bows. The one that took me was called the Robert E. Peary. I didn't know then that she had been built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. If I had, I might not have believed it. They loaded us efficiently, almost respectfully, no dogs, no shouting, just paperwork and patience. We filed aboard carrying small kits, expecting the stink of confinement. Instead, the air smelled of oil and salt, and something strangely clean soap. The ship's passageways gleamed like surgical rooms. I caught sight of electric fans, refrigerators, typewriters, luxuries for sailors, not kings. When we sailed, the harbor lights of Oran glimmered behind us like fading memories. Ahead lay the Atlantic, vast and indifferent. I had thought myself ready for death many times before, but that voyage filled me with a different kind of fear, the fear of realization. Each day the Americans fed us more than any of us had eaten in months, and each night I watched the sailors scrape half-eaten plates into bins. Meat, bread, fruit, gallons of milk, gone sour from neglect. One of them saw me staring once and said, laughing, "We can always make more." Those words sank into me like stones. We can always make more. Their waste wasn't arrogance, it was proof of abundance. A kind of effortless might that no uniform, no flag could disguise. I thought of the factory workers back in Essen toiling 12-hour shifts by candlelight, of my wife rationing butter by the gram, of my mother trading bread for coal. Here, food was endless. Power was endless. Even time seemed endless. One evening, as the sun bled into the ocean, I climbed up to the deck. A radar antenna turned above the bridge, a slow, constant motion. We had been told that Germany alone possessed this technology. Now I saw it mounted casually on a cargo ship, just another tool. Beside me, Lieutenant von Stobern Prussian, proud, born to aristocracy, watched it turn. His face was unreadable. Then he said quietly, "If this is what they put on their transports, we have already lost." The sea wind smelled of iron and freedom. In the mess hall below, someone was playing a harmonica. A group of sailors laughed at a joke I didn't understand. I thought of Berlin, blacked out and bombed, of Goebbels' voice on the radio promising victory, of children digging in rubble for coal. The ship's engines thrummed like a heartbeat beneath my feet. It was the sound of something immense, tireless, and alive. That night I didn't sleep. I stood by the porthole and watched the horizon glow faintly from the convoy ahead, 30 ships, each carrying what Germany could no longer dream of: fuel, food, weapons, even prisoners. I realized then that this voyage was not taking us deeper into captivity. It was carrying us, unwillingly, toward truth. When America rose from the sea at dawn, I knew that every kilometer of water behind us marked the death of an illusion, that Germany was the modern world's engine, and that we, its servants, had been driving a machine already rusting. We saw the American coastline before we truly believed it existed. A pale band of land shimmered through morning mist, framed by cranes taller than cathedrals. The Liberty ship slowed, the hum of its engine softening into a heartbeat that seemed to match my own. Norfolk Naval Base, our guards spoke the name with casual pride, as if describing the center of the world. What struck me first was the scale. Docks stretching farther than the eye could follow, ships of every shape and size lined side by side, cranes swinging like mechanical giants feeding on metal. Smokestacks, rail lines, warehouses, trucks, all moving in a rhythm so fast, so synchronized, it felt impossible that human hands directed it. In a single day, I learned later, that one harbor handled more cargo than Hamburg could in a week. I did not doubt it. As we disembarked, a sailor pointed at the horizon and said, "That's just one port." The arrogance in his tone wasn't cruel, it was the arrogance of certainty. I envied it. We were met not by barbed wire or barking dogs, but by an orchestra of machines. Forklifts darted between crates, electric trolleys glided along the piers, and everywhere, light always light. Even the warehouses glowed from within. It felt like walking inside a generator. We marched in columns through the port toward the waiting trains. The Americans had provided full passenger cars, not the wooden cattle wagons we had used for prisoners in Europe, but sleek Pullman coaches with padded seats and glass windows that caught the sunlight like mirrors. The guards called them sleepers. Some of us laughed bitterly. Sleepers for prisoners of war. Inside, there were dining cars with white linen and silverware. I ran a hand along the tablecloth, half expecting someone to slap it away. No one did. The air smelled faintly of leather, coffee, and machine oil, strangely comforting scents after months of dust and fear. When the train began to move, I pressed my face to the window again, as if I might wake from this hallucination. Norfolk fell away behind us, and with every mile, the vision grew stranger. The countryside was not war-torn. There were no ruins, no shortages, no hunger. We passed endless rows of houses, each one bright, each with a car in front. A car, not a bicycle or cart. In Germany, even the promise of the Volkswagen had been a lie. Here, ordinary workers drove to their jobs, fueled by a nation that seemed to know no limits. At the first stop, in a small Virginia town, I saw children eating ice cream and women shopping at lit store windows. The train's conductor apologized for the delay, apologized to us, his enemies, and offered water in paper cups. I took one just to feel its texture. The paper was thick, clean, and disposable. That word haunted me. Disposable. The next evening we stopped in Roanoke for coal and water. The yard was alive with machinery, electric pumps, automated loaders, cranes that lifted tons of coal in minutes. I had once been proud of Germany's engineering. Now it felt primitive. A single American railway yard used more electricity in an hour than my entire district in Berlin in a day. Our engineer prisoners murmured in disbelief. One of them, Muller, whispered calculations under his breath, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he had believed. "It's impossible," he said. "They waste power as if it were air." But it was real. The guards smoked American cigarettes and drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles, tossing them away half-finished. I watched one bottle shatter against the platform and thought of my wife washing and reusing jars because we could no longer afford glass. I realized then that the real enemy we had fought wasn't America's army. It was the boundless, tireless force of production. The war had made us blind to what it meant to be truly modern. When the train crossed into Tennessee, the night outside blazed like day. We passed towns still working, factories humming, shift whistles blowing even at midnight. It was not war fever, it was normalcy. Through the glass, I saw the Alcoa aluminum plant stretching along the river, furnaces pouring molten light into the darkness. The glow painted our faces red and gold. Someone whispered, "A city of fire." Later, near Louisville, we passed 4 synthetic rubber plants, vast as small countries. Even from the train, I could smell the tang of chemical air, see pipes like the veins of some mechanical god. Each plant was larger than anything I had seen in the Reich, and there were dozens more across the nation. Our chemist prisoners stared wordlessly. One of them, Hoffman, finally said, "We invented the process and they perfected it. They have made our genius ordinary." He said it with both awe and despair. When the train slowed again outside Detroit, we glimpsed the Willow Run plant. It was like watching a myth made flesh. B-24 Liberator bombers rolling down an assembly line longer than a city block. At first I thought they were models' unfinished fuselages shining under ceiling lamps, but then one moved, guided by cranes and women in overalls. Women. Thousands of them. Welding, riveting, carrying blueprints. A guard told us proudly, "We build a bomber every hour." Every hour. I turned to the window again. 17 aircraft stood in a row, each gleaming, each nearly ready for flight. In my chest, something broke, a quiet shattering, like glass under heat. We had been taught that American machines were crude, their people lazy, their soldiers weak. Yet here, I saw women assembling more power in a single hour than our factories could in a day. The deeper we traveled into the heart of America, the clearer the truth became. This country was not fighting a desperate war of survival. It was conducting an industrial symphony. The Germans had conquered half of Europe by consuming it. The Americans seemed to create more by merely existing. When the train stopped that night, somewhere in the Midwest, the sky was still glowing with factory light. Smoke rose not as a sign of ruin but as proof of purpose. I lay awake on my berth, the rails humming beneath me, and thought, we have marched into the future as prisoners. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. The second morning on the train began with a sound I had not heard in years: laughter. Someone in the next car had discovered that the seats folded into beds, and the simple marvel of it had reduced battle-hardened men to boys. We had slept on sand, in trenches, under broken trucks. Now even the cushions smelled faintly of perfume and sunlight. I lay there for a moment, staring at the patterned ceiling, thinking how strange it was to find comfort in captivity. Outside, the world kept changing. The further west we traveled, the more surreal it became. Fields spread into horizons, their edges lined with silver wires that glittered under morning dew. At first I thought they were telegraph lines, but an American guard explained they carried electricity to every farm, every farm. I wanted to tell him that in Germany, entire provinces still waited for that miracle, but the words died in my throat. The train rolled through Kentucky, and from the windows we could see the factories. Red brick fortresses exhaling steam, their chimneys never resting. Every window glowed, every yard was full of cars, tractors, and machines in motion. Even in small towns, neon signs blinked lazily in the daylight coffee shops, garages, diners. The excess felt unreal, almost indecent. By late afternoon, we crossed the Mississippi River on the Great Eads Bridge. Beneath us, barges drifted heavy with grain, so much grain that it seemed to flow endlessly, like another river beneath the one we crossed. One of the men beside me muttered, "They move food as we move ammunition." He was right. On both shores, towers of steel grain elevators, they called them rose like cathedrals. I thought of my village in Bavaria, where the harvests had been halved, where mothers lined for flour, where bread was rationed by weight and shame. Here, wheat was abundance made visible. I could almost smell it, golden and clean, a scent of impossible plenty. As dusk fell, the train passed Kansas City. The sky burned with the reflection of slaughterhouses and stockyards, a crimson haze that seemed to hum. The air smelled of iron and blood, and yet even here, everything moved with purpose, workers in clean uniforms, trucks full of meat. We pressed our faces to the glass, silent. In Africa we had fought over tins of horse meat. Here they threw beef scraps to dogs. One of the guards saw our expressions. "You boys hungry?" he asked, half joking, half kind. A few hours later, at a small station stop, he returned with paper bags, 15 hamburgers, wrapped and warm. Meat, cheese, vegetables, white bread. He paid with a single dollar bill. We ate slowly, reverently. Each bite tasted like blasphemy. I wrote that night, "They eat meat the way we eat dreams." The next morning the scenery softened again, flat plains, windmills, rivers that seemed to carry the whole sky on their backs. The train's rhythm had become hypnotic, almost musical. Whenever we passed through towns, people gathered to watch us go by, farmers, children, women in summer dresses. Some waved, others simply stared, perhaps trying to imagine what kind of monsters we had been. And yet, none of them looked afraid. In one town, a woman lifted her son so he could wave. The boy shouted something I didn't understand. The guard translated with a smile. He says, "Why do they look so tired?" We all laughed softly. It was the kind of question a child could ask without knowing how deep it cut. Somewhere in Oklahoma, the train stopped for supplies. I stepped onto the platform under guard supervision. The air was thick with heat and the scent of engine oil, but there was also something else: motion. Machines everywhere, cranes unloading coal, electric carts hauling water, men shouting cheerfully across noise that would have deafened any factory floor in Germany. And no smoke. That astonished me most. The air smelled clean. Electric motors, not coal fires. The silence of progress. As we moved again, I found myself wondering how such a country could ever be defeated, not with courage, nor strategy, nor even faith. Against this vast mechanical organism of light, power, and order, no ideology could stand. At night I leaned against the window and watched the lights pass. Town after town, every house lit, every road alive. I remembered the endless blackout drills in Berlin, the bombs, the darkness pressing against the glass while we prayed our walls would hold. Now, as the American night rolled by, bright, defiant, beautiful, I realized that light itself could be a weapon. A man across from me whispered, "They don't fear the dark." "No," I answered. "They own it." When the conductor announced we would arrive in Texas by morning, no one cheered. We were too busy watching the glow on the horizon, knowing it would only grow brighter. I closed my eyes, but the light stayed behind them. I had entered this country as a soldier of the Reich, armed with certainty. Somewhere along those tracks, that certainty dissolved quietly, painlessly, like a weapon rusting in the rain. The final stretch into Texas felt less like a journey through distance and more like a passage through disbelief. We had long stopped counting hours or towns. The windows framed an endless stream of miracles that had somehow become ordinary. Machines that didn't break down, lights that never went out, workers who never seemed exhausted. America, it seemed, had found a way to turn motion into permanence. That morning the guards told us we were passing near Detroit. I pressed my forehead to the window and saw it before they said the name. Smoke curled from hundreds of stacks, but even the smoke looked disciplined, organized into steady columns against the pale sky. And then I saw it. The Willow Run plant, the legendary factory we'd heard rumors about in North Africa. I could not believe the scale. It was not a building. It was a city, an industrial continent of concrete and steel, rivers of workers streaming through gates that seemed too wide for any map to capture. Through the haze, I saw the vast assembly lines, aircraft wings glinting like fish scales in sunlight, cranes moving fuselages into place. The American guard beside me said, "One bomber every 63 minutes. We thought he was lying. Then we saw the clock tower. On the ground below, B-24 Liberators 17. Perhaps more waited on the runway, half-painted, their metal skin flashing silver. Some had engines running already. The sound was a thunder that vibrated through the rails. And there, in the middle of it all, I saw women, thousands of them welding, riveting, carrying blueprints with pencils behind their ears. I had never seen women work with such authority, such focus. They looked neither tired nor burdened. They looked proud. Hoffman, our chemist, muttered, "They've erased the old world." He was right. We had been raised to believe order required obedience, hierarchy, and control. Yet here was a world thriving in chaos, driven by collaboration rather than command. No slogans, no portraits, no salutes, just efficiency born of confidence. The train curved south toward Street Louis, and we crossed the Mississippi again. The water shimmered gold beneath the sun, thick with barges moving grain, oil, steel. It was as if the river itself worked for them. From above, I could see warehouses the size of villages, grain elevators stacked like fortresses. Each one could have fed an entire German province for months. In Kansas City, the train slowed through the stockyards, and I smelled meat. The rich, heavy scent of fat and salt and fire filled the air for miles. Workers in white aprons moved among the cattle pens, shouting, laughing, eating as they worked. The sight sickened and amazed me at once. In Africa, we had fought over a can of horsemeat. Here, beef was so plentiful, they threw scraps away. Our guard, the same young sergeant who had fetched us hamburgers, leaned into our car. "They're saying you'll reach camp by nightfall," he said. "Hope you like Texas heat." He grinned and walked off, leaving behind the faint scent of tobacco and soap. I watched him go, struck again by how easily they smiled. Their war didn't seem to weigh on them. Maybe it couldn't. Hours later, as we crossed into the plains, I began to understand why. America was not fighting for survival. It was producing survival itself. Everywhere we looked, evidence of that truth multiplied. Endless rail lines moving in both directions, convoys of trucks loaded with steel beams, lumber, crates marked ordnance. The train passed a lumber mill where saws shrieked through timber so quickly that the air shimmered with dust. No guards, no barbed wire, just work. In Germany, every factory had been surrounded by fear. Here, industry was open to the sky. When we finally stopped near a refueling station, I stepped down with permission from the guard. The air was thick with heat and the electric hum of machines. I watched workers connect hoses, refill the engines, check the brakes. It took 27 minutes. In that time, the Americans had done what would have taken 2 hours in Germany, and they did it singing. A black worker leaned against a crate, drinking from a Coca-Cola bottle. Another man joked in English, and both laughed. I recognized their ease, the equality in that laughter. No one barked orders. They simply worked, and things worked with them. When the train began to move again, the rhythm of the wheels sounded like a pulse, steady and human. I wrote in my diary, "Their power comes from freedom, not fear." As the sun fell, the sky ahead glowed crimson, as if the entire horizon were made of fire. But it wasn't fire, it was factories. Somewhere out there, the aluminum furnaces of Tennessee burned bright enough to color the clouds. Each flame was a declaration that this country had resources we could not imagine. I leaned back in my seat, dizzy from the sight. The vibration of the train was like a heartbeat against my spine. I thought of my father's generation, who had worshipped order, discipline, sacrifice. I wondered what he would say if he saw this world where disorder produced miracles, where abundance replaced obedience. Someone behind me murmured, "If they live like this, what are they fighting for?" I didn't answer. Because I already knew. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to continue. And no empire built on fear could ever outlast that. When we crossed into Texas, darkness fell again, but it was never truly dark. The horizon pulsed with the same electric glow I had seen from the first night in Mexico. Factories, oil rigs, power lines, roads, everything alive, everything awake. America never slept. And as the train thundered west, carrying us deeper into captivity, I realized that captivity might not be the right word at all, because in that blinding light, for the first time in years, I saw the future. When the train finally stopped outside Mexico, Texas, it was long past midnight, yet the camp ahead of us shimmered like a small city. Rows of barracks stretched into the dark, every window alive with the same steady light that had followed us since Norfolk. The guards called it Camp Hearn. We called it the end of the world. And yet, as I stepped down, what I felt wasn't fear. It was confusion. I had expected wire fences, floodlights, men shouting orders, the familiar geometry of punishment. Instead, the night smelled of pine and sawdust. Somewhere beyond the barracks, a generator purred like a distant animal. One of the guards, a tall man with a slow southern voice, said, "You'll have breakfast in the morning, eggs and coffee, real coffee." He might as well have promised paradise. We were led to the barracks, wooden, clean, still warm from the day's heat. The beds had sheets. I ran my hands over the fabric as if touching an illusion. When the lights dimmed for the night, the hum of electricity lingered like a heartbeat in the walls. I closed my eyes and whispered to no one, "They don't even know how rich they are." The next morning, I tasted proof. The mess hall smelled of butter and bacon fat, and the steam from the coffee clouded the air in gold. We sat on benches, metal trays before us, each one filled with food that would have fed my whole family back home. Real eggs, meat twice a day, bread so white it hurt the eyes. I ate slowly, ashamed of the hunger that made me tremble. Someone laughed and said, "They feed us better than we fed our own." He was right. The camp itself was a marvel of construction. Built in 4 months, it held nearly 5,000 prisoners. The barracks were wired with electric light, flush toilets, hot showers, and even steam heating for winter. I had lived in apartments in Berlin that were less modern than this prison. The hospital was another shock. I was an orderly there for several weeks, assigned to help translate for the German doctors among us. I remember the day Dr. Bauer, our senior surgeon, walked into the medical ward for the first time. He stopped dead in the doorway, staring at the equipment. The clean steel tables, the X-ray machine, the glass cabinets full of medicines. When the American physician mentioned penicillin, he laughed out loud, then saw the bottles and fell silent. "You have it here?" he whispered. The American nodded. "We use it for everything: cuts, burns, infections." Dr. Bauer leaned against the wall, pale. "Our soldiers die for lack of salt tablets," he said. He wasn't exaggerating. That afternoon I watched them treat a young German with pneumonia. In Germany, he would have died. Here, they gave him penicillin and soup. He recovered in 3 days. When I told him he was lucky, he said quietly, "No, we are the unlucky ones. We fought for the wrong side." Every corner of the camp carried that same quiet revelation. The kitchens were run with mechanical precision, gas ranges big enough to cook for an army, mixers that turned dough by the barrel, walk-in refrigerators that hissed with cold air. I worked a shift there once. At the end of the day, we threw away bread, fresh bread, simply because regulations required a 10% surplus to ensure everyone ate enough. I wept as I dropped whole loaves into the bin. By August, they began sending work details into nearby farms. The first time I left the camp, I felt sunlight on my face, without the weight of fear. The guards were relaxed, rifles slung loosely on their shoulders. The truck rumbled down a road lined with cotton fields that shimmered under the heat. We stopped at a farm owned by a man named McAllister. He greeted us not as enemies, but as laborers. "Morning, boys," he said, wiping his hands on his overalls. "We've got work and water, and my wife made lunch." His wife, an American woman with sunburned cheeks and kind eyes. She waved from the porch, holding a jug of lemonade. I had been raised to see people like her, ordinary farmers, as the weak foundation of democracy. Yet she owned land, tractors, electricity, running water. Her workers, black and white alike, ate together in the shade. I could not look away from that simple, staggering equality. Later, during the lunch break, I sat beside a young American farmhand who couldn't have been older than 20. He drove a tractor that must have cost more than my family's house in Munich. I asked if it was his father's. He laughed. "No, this one's mine. Got it used last spring. My dad's waiting on the new John Deere model." He said it as casually as if talking about a new coat. I wanted to tell him that my father had never owned a car, that our village still plowed fields with horses, but I stayed silent. That night, back in camp, I wrote, "The world outside these fences is freer than any empire I served." More of us began to realize it. You could see it in the way men stopped quoting Hitler, stopped saying, "When we return in victory." They started reading the English primers handed out by the Americans. Some asked for newspapers, others began to paint, to play music, to speak openly of democracy. When September came, the Texas air turned dry and clear, and the fields glowed gold in the evening light. I stood one night by the fence and watched the horizon flicker with lightning from a far-off storm. The air smelled of rain and oil and freedom. I thought of my mother again, of her ration cards, her candles, the cold rooms of Berlin, and realized that this place of barbed wire and guards, was the first time I had truly felt safe in years. We had come as prisoners. But what the Americans had built here was something else, a mirror. Every comfort, every light bulb, every slice of bread reflected back at us the world we had destroyed by believing we were better than it. And the reflection was unbearable. By October, captivity had become a strange kind of education. Every day we were taken beyond the wire to work, sometimes on farms, sometimes in small factories, sometimes on roads that stretched straight into forever. What began as humiliation slowly became revelation. Each trip peeled back another layer of the illusion we'd carried across the ocean, that America was soft, divided, careless. I remember the morning the truck rattled to a stop outside a cotton gin near Houston. The machine inside was like something out of mythology, steel teeth spinning faster than my eyes could follow, drawing whole bales through its mouth and spitting them out white and clean. The sound filled the air, a deep, endless roar. The farmer who owned it, a man in overalls and a straw hat, wiped his brow and said, "That there does a month's work in an hour." I stared at him. "How many men to run it?" I asked. "Just me," he said. He had electricity from a dam hundreds of kilometers away, water from pipes, a truck, a car, a tractor. He wasn't a party member, an officer, or a nobleman. He was just an American farmer, and he lived like a baron. His workers, even the black men our propaganda had called slaves, wore good boots and ate sandwiches thick with meat. I didn't tell him that back home. Entire villages plowed by hand. Later that month, I was sent north to Nebraska to help with the sugar beet harvest. The fields there were so vast, they seemed to erase the horizon. The machines that crossed them moved like ships across a sea, combines taller than houses, their engines humming through the earth. A boy of 16 drove one, whistling as he worked. He waved to me as I passed, his hands stained with grease. I asked the guard, "How old is he?" "16, he said. "Why?" "In my country," I replied, "he'd be in uniform." The guard shrugged. "Here, he's building something worth keeping." That night, as I lay in my bunk, those words stayed with me. Worth keeping. We had fought to conquer. They built to preserve. And in that difference, everything we believed began to fall apart. The following week, I worked in a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, a journey that felt like traveling through time. I had worked in food production before the war, in a small canning plant near Hamburg, where 30 men labored from dawn to dusk. Here I watched a single elderly woman operate a row of machines that did the work of 50. Conveyor belts slid jars under steam nozzles, mechanical arms sealed lids, and rotating drums filled entire carts every minute. She sipped coffee while she worked, radio music playing nearby. When I told her that in Germany such automation would be controlled by the military, she laughed gently. "Machines are for making life easier," she said, "not for making war." Her words struck harder than any bullet I'd ever heard. One afternoon, I was assigned to unload coal at a power plant outside Detroit. Across the river rose the River Rouge complex, Ford's industrial empire. It was like watching the bloodstream of a god. Endless rails carried ore and steel. Conveyor belts ran like arteries. Cranes arched above like bones. I counted dozens of smokestacks, each one exhaling steady, confident power. A guard pointed across the water. "That plant alone uses more electricity than the whole city of Hamburg," he said. We laughed nervously, thinking it a joke. But later, I learned it was true. Even their waste had purpose. Scrap metal was sorted automatically, slag carried away by conveyor belts to be reused. The workers, men and women, both drove their own cars to the factory. Cars, thousands of them in the parking lots. In Germany, officers fought for gasoline rations. Here, a factory worker owned two. The sight twisted something inside me. I began to understand that power wasn't simply about production. It was about confidence. About a system that trusted its people enough to let them prosper. I had grown up in a nation where fear was the glue that held the machine together. Here, freedom was the lubricant that made it run. Everywhere we went, that same paradox repeated itself. America looked chaotic. Workers talking back to foremen, radios playing, people arguing. But beneath the noise was rhythm, a living, breathing order that no dictatorship could replicate. Once, while hauling crates in a mill, I asked an American supervisor how they managed so much with so little discipline. He smiled. "We don't make them obey," he said. "We make them care." It was then I realized why we had already lost, even if our armies still fought in Europe. By winter, we heard that the Americans were beginning to re-educate prisoners formally, books, newspapers, lectures. But the real lessons were already happening every day, in the fields and factories, in the ordinary decency of the people we met. One evening, after a long day of work, the sky over Texas turned copper with sunset. I stood by the fence, watching the silhouettes of oil derricks turning slowly against the light. The guard beside me offered a cigarette. We smoked in silence for a while. Then he said quietly, "You know, most of us don't hate you." I looked at him, startled. He shrugged. "We just figure you got bad leaders." For a moment, shame burned hotter than the sun ever could. In the weeks that followed, I found myself dreaming less of Germany and more of what I saw every day here: the humming machines, the kindness of strangers, the endless power lines stretching toward every horizon. It was a kind of freedom I had never been taught to imagine. And somewhere deep inside, I began to wonder whether I would ever want to leave it behind. It was December, when America taught me what mercy could look like. Not through politics, not through speeches, but through the smallest of things: a Christmas gift, a song in a language I had thought lost to kindness. The news that winter was grim. In Europe, the Eastern Front had turned into a graveyard. Our homeland, they whispered, was starving. We still marched in the mornings, still saluted the guards, still pretended to believe the Reich would endure. But by the evenings, when the work trucks returned to camp and the sky over Texas blushed into violet and gold, something softer began to replace the pride that had carried us across deserts and oceans. That December, rumors spread that American church groups were sending presents to every prisoner. We laughed, assuming it was propaganda. But the week before Christmas, the trucks arrived, crates upon crates marked with red crosses, stacked like a harvest. 500,000 parcels, someone said. For us. Inside were cigarettes, candy, notebooks, puzzles, shaving soap, small wooden crosses carved by hand. The guards handed them out gently, one by one. I remember the way the paper crackled under my fingers, the smell of chocolate, real chocolate, the first since 1939. For a long time, I couldn't eat it. It felt like a sin to unwrap kindness from the hands of an enemy. That night, as we gathered in the mess hall, the camp commander announced that the Methodist choir from town had come to sing for us. We shuffled out in disbelief. At the edge of the yard stood a group of women and boys in wool coats, holding candles against the wind. They began with Silent Night, but not the English version, the German one. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. The words hit me like a blow. Men who had survived tanks and bombers broke down quietly, shoulders shaking in the cold. The Americans sang until their voices trembled, and when they finished, they wished us Frohe Weihnachten and left behind baskets of cookies and cakes, still warm. I couldn't stop thinking about it. These were the wives, the mothers, the sisters of men who might even now be fighting ours. Yet they offered us songs and sweets instead of bullets. That night, under the dim lights of the barracks, I wrote in my diary, "This is not weakness, it is power, the kind we never understood." The next morning, the Boy Scouts from the nearby town came with handmade cards, bright drawings in crayon, snowmen, angels, stars. One read, "Peace soon." The boy who gave it to me couldn't have been older than 10. He smiled shyly and said, "For when you go home." I wanted to tell him that home might no longer exist, but I simply nodded, because for a moment I wanted to believe him. The feast came 2 days later. Turkey, ham, potatoes, gravy, pies, even ice cream. Ice cream. We ate until we couldn't move, until the sweetness hurt. Someone said quietly, "If they can feed their prisoners like this, how must their soldiers live?" No one answered. Afterward, I walked alone behind the barracks, the cold air sharp against my face. The stars were the same ones I had seen over Africa, over Berlin, over every place we'd marched to ruin. And yet they seemed closer now, warmer somehow, as if the distance between heaven and earth had narrowed. That Christmas marked the beginning of the end of faith not in God, but in the creed we had been forced to carry. In the weeks that followed, the camp newspaper changed its tone. The old propaganda gave way to essays about democracy, about what came after the war. Some of us began attending the American-run classes. They taught English, history, economics. The instructors spoke slowly, respectfully. They never mocked us. They wanted us to understand, not to surrender. I still remember the first lesson I attended. The professor, a thin man from the University of Chicago, wrote on the blackboard, "Freedom is not a gift. It is a responsibility." He looked at us and said, "You've seen what happens when fear builds nations. Now learn what happens when trust does." I sat there, pencil trembling, thinking of the faces of those women singing outside the fence. Even the most hardened among us began to change. The officers who had once shouted party slogans now sat reading American newspapers, discussing factory production, politics, art. They began to wonder aloud what Germany might look like rebuilt without tyranny. One confessed to me one night, "I used to believe loyalty was the highest virtue. Now I think it is humility." By February, the snow in Texas was gone, and the air smelled faintly of earth again. The guards had stopped calling us prisoners and started calling us men. We worked side by side with them, repairing fences, planting trees, building benches. They asked about our families. Some brought photographs of theirs, wives, children, dogs. One showed me a picture of his son and said, "He's learning German in school, so maybe next time we'll talk as friends." The thought made my throat tighten. By spring, I no longer felt caged. The fences were still there, the towers still watched, but the bars were in our minds, not theirs. The Americans, without meaning to, had done what years of war never could. They had dismantled the fortress inside us. When I looked at my hands, hands that had saluted Hitler, hands that had carried rifles, I no longer saw pride. I saw potential. It frightened me more than anything, because now I understood that what we had called destiny was only blindness, and what we had called weakness, in them, was strength. When spring came to Texas in 1944, the fields outside the camp bloomed with wildflowers, the sky stretching so wide that even memory felt small beneath it. We worked longer days then, sometimes in canneries, sometimes helping repair roads or load lumber trains. No one forced us anymore. We volunteered. Something in us had shifted. The hatred that had filled the silence of our captivity had drained away, replaced by a quiet hunger to understand the people who had conquered us without humiliation. By that summer, I was taking classes in the recreation hall history, economics, even English literature. We read American newspapers, discussed editorials, debated democracy. The American instructors never gloated. They spoke of systems, not superiority. "You have seen what fear builds," one professor told us. "Now imagine what trust can build instead." It was easy to imagine, because we had been living inside it. I remember the first time they showed us a film, Gone with the Wind. At first, we laughed at the melodrama, the accents, the color of it all. But when the screen filled with burning cities and the woman swore she'd never go hungry again, the laughter stopped. I saw men, German men, cry quietly in the dark. One whispered, "They even show their defeats." Later, another film, The Grapes of Wrath. Americans starving, protesting, suffering. They showed it to prisoners, enemies. We would never have shown weakness like that in Germany. Yet, in their honesty, there was power. I realized then that freedom didn't mean perfection, it meant permission to be human. By the end of that year, even our guards were no longer guards. They were companions. They shared cigarettes, traded jokes, argued politics with us. I worked one winter at a machine shop alongside a man named Thomas, who had lost his brother in France. When I tried to apologize for his death, he shook his head. "You didn't kill him," he said. "War did. We'll both have to live with that." He gave me a pocket knife as a parting gift when his unit transferred out. I still have it. Then came the day we saw the newsreels. April 1945. The concentration camps. The images flickered in silence at first: bodies, fences, faces that were no longer faces. Someone behind me whispered, "Propaganda." But the next reel showed American soldiers, our guards, helping survivors, feeding them, crying. I watched one guard I knew, his face streaked with ash and grief, carrying a child from a pile of corpses. I felt my stomach twist. That night no one slept. We sat on our bunks, whispering, arguing, denying, then finally weeping. One of our officers, who had worshipped the Führer like a god, tore the insignia from his old jacket and threw it into the stove. "We thought we were warriors," he said. "We were servants of monsters." In that moment, the last wall inside me fell. A few weeks later, the war was over. Germany surrendered. They let us listen to the radio broadcast in the mess hall. The American commander stood quietly beside us, hat in hand. When it ended, he looked up and said, "Now you can begin again." We did. The last months of captivity were filled with lessons: how to manage farms, how to repair engines, how to build without breaking. The Americans called it vocational training. I called it preparation for redemption. They gave us books about democracy, blueprints for agriculture, manuals for machines we had never dreamed of. I studied everything I could, as if knowledge itself might cleanse me. When they finally told us we would be sent home, no one cheered. We stood in silence. Some men cried. The thought of Germany ruined, divided, starved, felt like returning not to a home, but to a grave. And yet, the Americans treated our departure like a graduation. They handed us clothes, medical checkups, even small packets of food for the journey. One officer said, "You'll rebuild your country. You've already started." I didn't understand then what he meant. I do now. We sailed east on a Liberty ship, the same kind that had carried us into captivity. But this time the sea looked different. The horizon glowed not with dread but with possibility. Somewhere in the dark, I could see the faint outline of a continent that no longer existed, the old Germany, and another that might still be born. When we docked, I stepped onto a land of ruins, cities hollowed, streets cratered, people thin as shadows. My mother didn't recognize me at first. When she asked what America had been like, I didn't know how to explain it. I simply said, "They treated us as men." Years passed. I found work helping rebuild power stations. The tools, the wiring, even the safety posters, they all bore traces of what I had learned in captivity. Democracy, we realized, could not be taught with speeches. It had to be practiced, piece by piece, machine by machine, hand by hand. I often thought of Texas, the light, the sound of machines, the faces of the guards who became teachers. Those memories became my compass. When Germany divided, I stayed in the West, believing that the future lay with the world that had defeated us, not through cruelty, but through decency. Decades later, in 1985, I returned to America for a reunion of former prisoners. We gathered in Austin, old men with gray hair and trembling hands. The air smelled of pine and gasoline, exactly as I remembered it. The hall was full of both Americans and Germans, enemies once, now old friends. When the speeches began, I found myself unable to listen. My eyes fixed on the American flag hanging above the stage, not as a symbol of conquest, but as a reminder of mercy. Then one of our own, now a doctor from Maine, stood and said what we all felt. We came as enemies. We left as students. America showed us that strength does not come from conquest, but from creation, not from hate, but from humanity. When the applause came, it was thunderous, not for victory, but for understanding. I clapped until my palms stung, and for the first time in my life I cried without shame. That night, as the lights dimmed, I stepped outside and looked at the Texas sky. The stars were the same as they had been 40 years before, still burning with impossible brightness. Only now, I understood their meaning. They were not symbols of power. They were reminders of promise, proof that light, when shared, never diminishes. I had come to this country in chains and left with something far heavier: knowledge. That a free society's true weapon is not its armies or its machines, but its decency. And that night, beneath those endless American stars, I whispered what I should have said the day I first saw them. Thank you.